Now that Metroid Prime 4 is out, Metroid Prime 3 is in an interesting position. Prime 4 was no doubt affected by a number of things during the long 18-year gap between entries, with Prime 4 coming out in 2025, and Prime 3 releasing all the way back in 2007. In comparison, Prime 3 was a game made shortly after the previous two, with the last game releasing in 2004. With all that recent experience and success, Prime 3 should theoretically represent the peak of the series' design and quality. But now with the release of 4, I found out a lot of people think of Prime 3 as the source of its problems, that you can tell that Prime 4 was going to be bad because of the direction 3 was going in. I can kinda see where that comes from. Metroid Prime 3 was a sequel that got a bit experimental, you see. It attempted a different kind of narrative, one with a more active supporting cast that Samus is frequently made to interact with, whether it be chatting with or fighting alongside. The map design was also very different. Rather than a series of interconnected zones, Prime 3 divides its map between several different planets, with Samus' ship being the sole link between them. There's other things I could add, but the point is that Metroid Prime 4 doubled down on a lot of Prime 3's ideas, to the disappointment of many. I also was disappointed by Prime 4, but I do disagree with a lot of its comparisons to Prime 3. I think it's a very different game, and that its ideas produce very different results to Prime 4's ideas. All these thoughts left me with a desire to go back and re-examine Prime 3, to learn exactly how that game compares to the rest of the series, including 4, and I've decided to do so with today's video. Today we are going to examine this game as a whole. We'll examine how its deviations truly affect the overall experience, as well as how they possibly inform on the current state of the Prime series. Today, let's see if Metroid Prime 3 truly corrupted the franchise. Let's start by going over the intro, as it stands out amongst the intros of other Metroids. Now, the intros to Metroids usually start off with a narration of sorts to establish basic plot beats. Afterwards, when gameplay begins, dialogue becomes much more sparse as visual storytelling takes over. This is so the game can firmly pull you in with its atmosphere. The prior two Prime games are similar, but also add in Samus' ability to scan the environment to fill out more narrative details and further build their atmospheres. Metroid Prime 3 in comparison is more similar to other classic first-person shooters. Rather than investigating some eerie environment, you start by boarding a Galactic Federation vessel known as the Olympus in order to be briefed on a new mission. As opposed to the usual site of death and destruction, this ship is more clean and lively. It's filled with NPCs that you can interact with, as well as more casual interactions with the environment. One thing you gotta do in this section is that you have to enter in Samus' ID in order to access the briefing room, which helps gives the impression that this is all very routine. So far, it's a nice change of pace from what was experienced before. Compared to before, a different kind of tension and mood permeates the air, one that's normal and routine, but almost too normal. The only real criticism I have is that there isn't really anything interesting to scan. In prior games, your complete lack of information would compel you to scan the area to try and put together as much information as you could. All that information gathering played a good part in building up and establishing the game's primary conflict. While it admittedly doesn't make much sense to investigate a place where everything is routine, I felt that they could have at least drip-fed us some lore in a way that fit the location. Maybe in the form of recent reports that we could have scanned from computers, although they actually kinda start doing that later, and we'll talk about that stuff at a later part. In the place of interesting scans, having the NPCs chat about some relevant stuff would have also helped this intro stand out a bit more. But they don't really have much to say other than, "Hey Samus," and "I'm busy."
Aren't you Samus Aran? It's an honor to meet you.
Sorry, I'm on duty. I can't talk now.
When you arrive to the briefing room, you briefly meet the rest of your fellow bounty hunters being assigned to this particular mission. We're also introduced to the Aurora unit, one of many brain-computer beings that both run and are the core network of the entire Galactic Federation. However, this unit informs us that the network is in danger. Space pirates recently attacked a ship known as the GFS Valhalla and managed to make off with one of these Aurora units. And whatever they have done with the unit has resulted in many other units being infected with some sort of virus, with our unit here just barely avoiding infection themselves. Samus and the bounty hunters are brought in to be assigned the delivery of vaccines to the currently infected units. But before we can be sent off, we're suddenly attacked by space pirates. What follows is the most bombastic beginning in Metroid history. The other games' intros certainly have their action sequences, but this intro contains set piece after set piece. Several things explode all around Samus as you fight your way through several waves of pirates. Sometimes you're by yourself, and other times with other troopers. You chase after pirates playing keep away with a battery, you escape a swarm of bug creatures, and right after you unlock the missile launcher, you have a boss fight to cap off the ship sequence. The boss fights will have their own section, but for now I will say that this boss is a pretty simple but decent showcase of the motion controls, testing your aim the appropriate amount by having you shoot back its attacks to expose its weak point. A decent fight overall. The action continues on the planet Norian, as its invasion is the primary objective of the pirates. It is in this section where Prime 3 fully embraces FPS standards at the time. While earlier we were fighting alongside our fellow troopers, we are now doing so while being explicitly told where to go and what to do, in a strict order. Now, what I'm describing arguably sounds like what a lot of people were afraid of when the first Metroid Prime was coming out. That is, being a first-person shooter that barely resembles a Metroid game. But there's no need to worry, because this introductory sequence represents a minority of the game's experience. And while it's very bombastic, there is still some good Metroid to experience within it. There are still navigational puzzles to complete, and even in this intense sequence of events, you are still rewarded with logs and items for taking your time and exploring. The combat sequences themselves are mostly just reiterating elements from the pirate fights of previous games, with the addition of the lasso, which you obtain at the beginning of this section. The lasso allows you to pull shields off of certain enemies, and may serve as a possible indicator of more complex enemy design later on. Also included in this section are your fellow bounty hunters helping out. Every bounty hunter gets at least a single scene where they go, "Hey Samus," and show their stuff. And they are nice, if brief, moments of characterization, at least for now. At this time, the Ice Wielder Rundus stands out as particularly likable, as he is a charming mix of incredibly cocky and having respect towards ya. And by that I mean, he definitely thinks he's the best and the greatest, but he doesn't use that to look down on anyone, and his few brief scenes sell his character pretty strongly.
While you head that way, I'll activate the generator on the west side. Between the two of us, this should be a breeze.
I've already stated that boss fights will have their own sections, but I do want to take a moment and acknowledge the Ridley fight that occurs here. This fight plays very simple, as is fitting for the early game. It's a simple matter of shooting Ridley's weak point while dodging and countering attacks. But the entire spectacle of fighting while falling through a chasm, as well as how individual moments reflect the hatred felt between these two characters, makes this simple fight one of the best in the entire series. I'm not sure anything could top the Ridley fight in Metroid Prime 1, but this one comes real close on spectacle alone. At the climax of this introduction, a giant meteor appears, and it's revealed to us that the entire purpose of this attack was for the pirates to crash land this rock onto the planet. Your primary objective throughout this whole attack has been to restore the planet's defenses, and this meteor makes that objective even more imperative. After restoring power, the last step is to reactivate the defenses in the central tower. On the way there, you witness several Federation soldiers make use of an interesting technology in order to gain an edge on the space pirates. After that, you join up with the other bounty hunters at the tower's elevator, but when you arrive, an old foe confronts the group. Dark Samus tries to disrupt our efforts with a devastating attack, but luckily Samus is able to get the defenses back online through sheer force of will. One month later, Samus wakes up from a coma, and things are quite different as you can imagine. Dark Samus's attack, as it turns out, gave Samus and the other bounty hunters a condition which causes their bodies to generate the substance known as Phazon on their own. If you have been following the plots of previous games, you may be both familiar and concerned with this. In response to this medical abnormality, the Galactic Federation seemed fit to outfit us with Phazon enhancement devices, aka PED. These devices are the same devices that we briefly witnessed other soldiers using, and since our bodies now generate Phazon naturally, we have no need of carrying the large backpacks filled with the stuff. Now, getting some sort of infection and immediately being told to take advantage of its power is a little bizarre, to put it lightly. But check this out. Anyway, while Samus was in a coma, the three other bounty hunters were sent on individual missions, all involving something called Leviathan Seeds. It turns out that the meteor that was going to hit Norian was one of many Leviathan Seeds, and three others managed to successfully crash onto other planets, infecting them with what's in them. None of the other bounty hunters have reported to the Federation in quite some time, so now Samus's new mission is to investigate their disappearances as well as complete their missions by destroying these seeds. And now we have arrived at the end of the intro. From here on out, the meat of the game begins as we set off on our main mission. It did take a bit longer to learn of our main objective than the other games, but that's because Prime 3 wanted to take a lot of time to set up a different kind of story, one with character arcs and different kinds of stakes. This intro was filled with a lot more action than usual, but that is pretty refreshing. It did something unique by expanding on the action sequences meant to cap off these intros. Plus, isn't it just nice that each of the intros to the Prime games managed to do their own thing? Prime 1 was like a 3D version of the Super Metroid intro, Prime 2 leaned more towards horror, and Prime 3 is the action intro. Admittedly, Prime 3's intro does guide your hand more aggressively, but that was just the intro. You can certainly expect more traditional Metroid gameplay from here on out. Or can you? Right now at this point, I feel it most important to talk about how progression works now that the game is split off into several zones rather than taking place on one planet. To do that, let's start by establishing some basic Metroidvania design ethos. Metroidvanias are about exploration. It's about uncovering and backtracking through a large map of tightly designed and interconnected rooms. What happens as you explore these rooms? Well, quite often is that you get stopped. You run into doors you can't open, areas blocked off by barriers, natural or otherwise. You see a shiny power-up and it's just too far out of reach. But these small moments of frustration have a purpose. The emotion you feel from being blocked allows your brain to take note of these barriers more effectively. What this means is that the moment you get the power-up meant to surpass that barrier, you can be drawn back to that location where you now know further progress can be made. You see, the game's puzzles are not just small brain benders contained to single rooms. The entirety of the world is a puzzle where you need to be always gathering information, where you can and can't go and what you can do. And fitting this information correctly is how you're guided through the world. Also, solving this world puzzle should consistently reward the player. It doesn't always have to be power-ups you're rewarded with, and it doesn't always need to result in main story progress. Other Metroidvanias have certainly experimented with other types of rewards to great success. But regardless of the finer details, the player should always be rewarded for solving the puzzle of the map. A really good example of this design being successful can be found in Metroid Prime 2. At one point while navigating the bog area, you come across a purple door that blocks your current progress. There is no clear alternate path, but you did recently obtain the Super Missile ability, and by eyeballing the map, you are able to discern a couple of possible places this new item could be located. Depending on what you choose, you can find the multi-missile launcher right away by heading to the Sky Temple. But if you end up somewhere else, you will still come across several upgrades that make things easier and also open up other parts of the map. In other games, not being able to find progress would be much more irritating, but in a very tightly designed Metroidvania, every unexplored part of the map has something beneficial or interesting in it, and this means getting lost isn't the problem, as you're getting rewarded every step of the way. It's also important to note that this style of exploration is less rewarding if the player is told exactly where to go. Being denied the opportunity to put together where to go yourself undermines the purpose of worlds designed like this. Although occasionally, something like an objective marker is needed, because all Metroidvanias, and I do mean all Metroidvanias, share a common problem. They eventually get so big that the amount of possible routes becomes overwhelming, and finding where you want to go becomes a tedious exercise of checking far too many rooms and hitting far too many walls. So even if guidance goes against our basic design ethos, some guidance eventually becomes necessary in order to curb the natural consequences of a large interconnected map. With all of this in mind, the question is, how does Prime 3 handle its exploration when the map is split up the way that it is? First, let's talk about objective markers. With a couple exceptions, the map usually always displays and marks the exact room the main objective is located, and unlike the prior two games, you don't have the ability to turn this off. This is because all these objectives are always given to you via these communications.
If you can use the satellite uplink on the ship, you may be able to access information concerning the seed. Prepare to receive the ship's coordinates now.
These communications are a new feature in this game, and since they convey important plot information alongside our objectives, it makes sense that we don't have the ability to turn them off. Being unable to prevent this information coming our way may seem like it goes against the design ethos we've established, but for the most part it doesn't, and that's because these communications only mark the destination on the map. The path to get to it is still hidden, and more often than not, heading to the room in a straight line is not an option. Like before, you still need to explore properly. It's also important to note that while the room itself is marked, it's not as blatant as the optional hint system in the prior two games. There is no visible marker. And if the marked room is one you've already visited, you only be able to tell where the objective is by highlighting the room itself. This allows you the option to just listen to the dialogue and avoid its guidance. However, there are a couple of instances where objective marking is a bit of a problem. In the Prime 2 example I gave earlier, I described how a locked door in a recent power-up directed you to finding the right power-up in a different area. It's also one of the few moments where the game requires you to temporarily leave the current zone. Prime 3 also has moments like these, but rather than you needing to figure that out, you are always told when you need to return to a previous area.
The item you need may reside on a world you have previously visited.
The game very much robs you of your ability to intuit that specific step, but due to how the maps are split up, it ends up being kinda necessary. Going back to Prime 2 again, that game makes it very clear through its map design that you are meant to revisit areas. Like Prime 3, it has objectives that are tied to each zone, but you still unlock shortcuts to previously visited areas, and the central hub area has such a large variety of obstacles that you're always drawn back there one way or another. In place of those shortcuts, Prime 3 has landing zones, which cannot possibly direct you back to a specific area since you can fly to any landing zone using Samus's ship. So when you have to revisit an area, the game will just let you know right away and spoil that part of you figuring it out. Another change that affects exploration is how the game's maps are further split up. And I'm not referring to how the maps are split up between planets, but for some reason, the maps on the planets themselves are also split up into smaller areas. And travel between these areas mainly require the use of your ship, with the occasional use of more unique types of transports. Because many of these areas start out so small and separate, there are many parts of the game where your progression through the map is blatantly linear. To elaborate on that, progressing in these instances first has you land somewhere, follow a series of rooms on a path, reach a dead end which either contains a power-up or something that redirects you to another location, and then you end up having to walk straight back on the exact same path. Sometimes there are shortcuts that make that more convenient, and other times you just gotta make your way the whole way back, and then you transport to another path and start exploring there. This progression, combined with being given objectives, can sometimes make you feel like you're being forcibly funneled somewhere, but most of the time, these back and forths don't really feel that grating. After all, when you head back down the same path with a new power-up, that very power-up can make the backtracking enjoyable. And most of these back and forths are front-loaded anyway. Most of them occur on the first planet Brio, and they dissipate as you progress through the second planet Elysia, and then you're back to more back and forth and all-around exploration. And that's kind of it. You might have been wondering how all these changes affect Metroid Prime 3's exploration. And the thing is, you're told where to go sometimes, and the map is divided differently, but none of these things made it feel any less like I was playing a Metroid Prime game. You're still going back and forth between rooms, taking mental notes, intuiting paths and solutions. You're still rewarded with extra items and story when you take your time and observe environments. I unfavorably compared this game to Prime 2 earlier because you're told to revisit an area, rather than being allowed to figure that out yourself. But despite that, the act of revisiting an area is still just as fun as before. It's still a great opportunity to further explore an area with your new powers in order to solve puzzles you couldn't before, all the while upgrading Samus on the way to grabbing the next progression-based power-up. And being told when to start backtracking can be seen as better than otherwise. It prevents you from making the mistake of going back too early, resulting in additional and more redundant backtracking. The exploration-based progression ends up feeling the same, and that's great because more Metroid Prime is great. But it's also kinda disappointing. It's disappointing because a lot of these changes implied a drastically different experience, and I'm left thinking about what could have been done had Retro Studios expanded on these ideas further. Take the ship for example. Despite being a new addition in this game, I didn't feel the need to talk about it earlier because it doesn't really change much. Don't get me wrong, it's pretty cool to have as a save point, and sitting inside of it and pushing buttons is fun and cozy. But its integration into the main gameplay loop is very minimal. Unlocking landing pads could have been this reoccurring thing. The player would be required to solve puzzles in order to unlock more convenient travel and relief in the form of its save point. It would go a long way to making this game stand out in the series. But there's only 2 instances in the whole game where you need to solve a puzzle to unlock a landing pad, whereas all others just need to be found. There are also puzzles that involve using the ship. There's a couple moments where you need to command the ship to blow up a couple things, and there's also puzzles where you need to locate and transport large objects with the ship. Those transporting puzzles are actually pretty enjoyable, and a highlight among this game's puzzles. They do a good job of rewarding your memory and tendencies to scan the environment, and it's just kinda satisfying to unlock progress by hauling large objects across the map. The ship can also do bombing runs. Yeah, this is the only Metroid game, possibly the only Metroidvania game where you can call airstrikes, which completely annihilate the enemy. But I almost completely forgot about this feature because you have so few opportunities to use it, and the action itself is so unconventional and unnecessary that you rarely think to use it. So the ship's additions are nice overall, it's just that they're minimal and they don't really fundamentally change the experience. Going back to the map design, the map is divided into 3 main planets and you're immediately given access to 2 of them. This makes sense narratively because Samus is sent to investigate where the other bounty hunters have gone and she currently knows of 2 locations. This also implies that you have a choice where you progress first. But if you jump to Elysia first, you're immediately blocked by a door you can't get past until you beat the last boss of the first planet, Brio. Despite the map implying otherwise, you are still meant to progress these areas in a strict order, which isn't a bad thing, but why imply that you can choose in the first place? It's disappointing because being able to choose where you progress alone would have made this game quite refreshing. While you're always figuring out the main route in Metroid games, it is not often you get to choose the main route, shaping your own experience. Multiple routes would have given the game replay value, it would have made speedrunning much more interesting. But progress in Prime 3 ends up being the exact same as Prime 2. 3 main areas, done in order, with occasional revisits. They actually make this mistake again in Prime 4, where they imply nonlinear progression where things have to be done in order.
Looks like there's 3 keys left. Up to you to decide which one to go after first.
Just to be clear, the game being linear is fine, but being made to think otherwise just sabotages our expectations. It's just another aspect of this game that appears different, but ends up being the same as prior games. These shortcomings with the exploration and the ship do have an explanation as it turns out. Some time ago, the website Video Games Chronicle did a lengthy interview with a former senior director of Retro Studios. In this interview, the former director reveals that there were in fact plans for a much larger, non-linear open world. He also stated that the use of Samus's ship was originally meant to have use beyond all the scripted sequences we ended up with. But these plans would be cut when Retro realized that the Wii just didn't have enough power to make these ambitions a reality. This also explains the addition of ship missile expansions to increase the ship missile capacity. While barely helpful in the current game, they make much more sense with a version of the game where you use the ship more frequently. So Retro's goal was to properly expand and alter the design, it's just that they weren't able to. But on a more positive note, I do think they were able to properly alter the combat. Let's talk about that now. Compared to exploration and progression, the combat in the Prime games could use some change. Outside of bosses, combat in classic Metroid is usually a side activity. Many enemies that are in your way aren't in your way for long, and any exception to that case slowly becomes the norm as Samus gains more power. And if you're comfortable with your current resources, there's no need to even bother with enemies. With enough skill, you can avoid many enemy encounters entirely. Combat in Metroid Prime is very similar. However, Samus's power in these games doesn't increase in the same way as the 2D ones. Samus does get access to very resource-heavy attacks later on, but her basic beam attacks always do the same amount of damage. Enemies are still mostly just an obstacle, but the Prime series often experiments with more complex enemies. Enemies that you need to strafe around to hit a weak point, or maybe an enemy that requires the Morph Ball or a specific beam type to damage. On top of this, they also have more heavy-set types of enemies, more tankier enemies that have the ability to hit you hard and also have several methods to avoid damage. These methods are going invisible, using shields, or even becoming invincible temporarily. This kind of enemy ends up being a big part of Prime's combat problems. Despite their uniqueness, the game treats them the exact same as all of its other enemies, which means that when Samus is 1 or 2 rooms away, they are set to respawn. And in a genre that requires a lot of backtracking, this means that you end up encountering these tougher enemies way more often than you should. The enemies themselves are not badly designed, they are easily understood and require an adequate amount of skill to defeat, and fighting them for the first time can make for a pretty exciting set piece. But being forced to deal with their large health bars and invincibility frames every time you enter their room just wastes your time. It wastes your time when you would rather just stop by the room to solve a new puzzle and grab an upgrade. You have already proven yourself against these tough enemies, so being forced to beat them repeatedly in the same circumstances is just redundant. These fights also expose the fundamental issues with Metroid Prime as a first-person shooter. And those issues stem from how Metroid was brought into first person. The transition from side-scrolling to first person was going to make Samus feel different no matter what, but Retro tried to preserve the feeling of side-scroller Samus as much as they could. This meant that Samus's health and gun work the exact same way. Samus's health starts at 100, and with every energy tank she gets 100 more, up to a massive 1400 total. And Samus's gun still fires infinitely, with only the missiles being a finite resource. Because of this, Metroid Prime tends to lack the resource management that makes a lot of other first-person shooters engaging. Learning to manage both limited health and ammo while dispatching enemies efficiently is a part of what I believe makes those games satisfying. Early on in the Prime games, when health amounts are lower, fights can be kinda thrilling, but enemies later on are never really able to keep up with the exponential rate that Samus's health increases, making them more nuisances than challenges. That combined with never needing to reload or manage ammo means that a lot of enemy encounters can be beaten without much thought or variety of action on your part. This in of itself is not an issue. Combat being a side activity is fine in a Metroid-type game, and it's not like combat always needs to be thrilling to be satisfying anyway. It is only when we are forced to refight these tougher enemies that these shortcomings really affect the experience. On top of these fights being redundant, Samus's resources not mattering in these encounters means that they have no long or sometimes even short-term consequences. They really are redundant in every way, and there is just so much footage of me fighting these guys by just standing in one place charging super attacks while carelessly eating every hit. I learned to play the games that way just so I could be rid of these fights as soon as possible, and I think the fact that I was able to do so in that way is probably the best demonstration of the combat's flaws. And while I am getting a bit ahead of myself, I should mention that the combat is in no way flawed during boss fights. Boss fights make full use of Samus's abilities in order to provide an interesting fight, and they are more than capable of threatening you damage-wise, no matter how many energy tanks you've collected. The combat overall is good, but also very limited, and you're unfortunately made to feel those limits every time you fight a certain style of enemy. A potential answer to these problems comes in the form of Prime 3's PED suit, which allows Samus to go into hyper mode. By holding down a button, you can drastically increase Samus's combat abilities. Enemies that could take up your time normally go down in seconds from just normal shots in this mode, and it's really satisfying. If you ever get tired of a particular enemy encounter, hyper mode is there to just delete it from existence. Of course, such power should have a cost. The game informs you that a single instance of hyper mode takes up one of your energy tanks, but that is not entirely true. You see, once you activate hyper mode, your health is replaced with this meter that drains as you fire shots, and this meter directly correlates with the energy tank that is spent to enter hyper mode. In other words, if you only use half the meter, you will only use half the energy tank. It's probably done this way to prevent the player from annihilating their own health bar from just entering hyper mode, and it's appreciated since it allows you to test and adapt to the mechanic without severe consequences. Later, the game adds a second drawback to hyper mode to further balance it. If you have it active for a few seconds too long, your meter will turn red and start filling, and if you're unable to exhaust this meter before it fills up, you reach terminal corruption, giving you a unique game over. All these things ensure that hyper mode is a fun and well-balanced mechanic. At the beginning of the game, where you have like 3 or 4 energy tanks. Like the previous games, you get up to 14. And even before that, the ever-increasing pool of health, plus a decently generous supply of health pickups, means that the balance is kind of a joke. Hyper mode's health drain just cannot keep up, and it will do very little to stop you if you want to use hyper mode in literally every fight in the game. I guess there's also the threat of terminal corruption, but that quickly becomes a non-factor as you get used to quickly expending hyper mode's energy. And even without those skills, terminal corruption takes a good moment to even start, and even longer to actually cause a game over. The only reason you're seeing footage of it here is because I intentionally set it off to get that footage, since it rarely occurred naturally when I was taking the game seriously. In the early game, a typical encounter tends to go like this. You've just played Metroid Prime games back to back, and now this fight is taking a bit too long, like the more redundant fights in those games. So you pop hyper mode for a second, delete the enemies, breathe a sigh of relief, and then continue exploring. And in the later game, you stop bothering with that song and dance and just pop hyper mode on sight, every single tough guy you see. And it's awesome. It's completely unbalanced and makes the very idea of a challenging encounter a joke. In prior games, all of the energy tanks you've collected would lead to a lot of unexciting enemy encounters. But in this game, you can annihilate all of those encounters in seconds. It makes all of the backtracking in this game the best in the series. You're no longer wasting your time on long encounters. You can just exterminate and get to puzzle solving. And again, the power difference between normal Samus and hyper mode Samus just makes the mode extra cathartic. It is only a band-aid for Prime's combat problems. It's not a solution that changes what those issues are. Enemy design is essentially the same as before, and Samus's options to fight them are still quite limited. I drew attention to the lasso earlier in the video, but it didn't really add much in the end. It's stiff and unfun to use, and I only ended up using it when it was required. In fact, if it wasn't for hyper mode, Samus's options would be the most limited in the series. While the prior games offered a selection of different beam types Samus could fire, Prime 3 opts to have every single beam upgrade stack on top of each other, much like how the 2D games did it. And also, the Ice Beam is now stacked on top of your missiles. Hyper mode is also ultimately just a gimmick meant only to exist in the game it's introduced in. Much like the Dark World mechanic in Metroid Prime 2, it's a gimmick exclusive to its game and its plot, and once that plot is over, so is the gimmick. But it properly mixes things up, and it makes Prime 3 the best game to end off on when you go through this series again. When the combat in those games gets stale and you're tired of dealing with redundant enemy encounters, Hyper Mode very thoroughly rids you of those frustrations, and it's something I always look forward to whenever I replay this game. On the topic of combat, I also need to talk about the boss fights and how Hyper Mode affects that. You might think that something like Hyper Mode could end up trivializing these encounters, but despite its existence, boss fights remain essentially the same balance and quality as the prior games. Like before, boss fights are the only real threat to your health bar, and now with the addition of Hyper Mode, managing your health requires just a bit more attention than before. Spamming Hyper Mode just to maximize damage to the boss will only result in your own health draining much faster than the boss's, so you will have to plan your use of Hyper Mode to maximize damage while staying alive. Other than that addition, boss fights follow the same philosophy as prior games. They are all about learning their attack patterns to stave off death while figuring out how to expose their health bar to damage. Just as fun as they've always been, with a little more, and this feeling applies to all the bosses. Although I should comment on the uniqueness of a certain group of bosses. Now, even though this is an 18-year-old game, I feel I should let you know that the spoilers begin here. So if you do want to skip this section, skip to here. But if you're still here, let's talk about these fights and the game's story. After talking about the experiments ran with map design and combat, all that remains is the all-encompassing experiment of Prime 3's narrative. First, let's talk about the fates of our fellow bounty hunters. So the game is subtitled Corruption, and Phazon is very obviously this bad thing, even if you haven't played the prior games. I mean, the main villain's essentially made of the stuff, no more evidence is needed. So when we learn early on that our friends are missing, and that they also have the same Phazon bug Samus has, it comes as a little surprise that they became corrupted in order to become boss fights. These boss fights, of course, play very well, like the rest of the boss fights in the game, just getting that out of the way. The build-up to them is what makes them a highlight. You get to see all of these characters in action beforehand, which allows you to imagine how their boss fights will play out. After that, environmental storytelling takes over, as we discover signs of our friends on each planet. Seeing these signs help further build anticipation towards the eventual fight. And when we finally encounter them and are forced to fight them, all of that anticipation pays off with a well-designed fight. There's also this tragic element to the whole thing. We've spent the beginning of this game getting to know these characters and fighting alongside them, and we know they aren't fighting us of their own will. But because of this corruption, we have no choice but to cut them down. Witnessing the fate of these bounty hunters also helps reinforce the threat of Samus's own corruption. It gives us a grim reminder that on top of fighting to save the galaxy, Samus is now also fighting for her own life and autonomy. On the subject of Samus's corruption, there's also some fun details that change as that progresses. Every time you beat a world boss, Samus's corruption gets worse, and you can actually track the level of corruption using the bioscanner on her ship. On top of that, if you keep a close eye on her reflection, you can actually see the corruption slowly altering her face as it worsens. Another detail that is fun if you've played the prior games is that pools of Phazon now heal you, which feels wild when you remember that Phazon absolutely ate away at your health previously. Just another thing that reinforces the oddness of Samus's condition. Back to the narrative of these boss fights, I'd say that everything about them was a successful experiment. Outside of Ridley and Dark Samus, the bosses in the Prime series don't get a lot of narrative push, so the effort put into these bounty hunters is welcome. Unfortunately, like all the other experiments, I'm left feeling like more could have been done. While everything done with these characters are nice and novel, their actual characters end up feeling underdeveloped. The scenes in the intro are all we get for these characters until they are corrupted, and then after that, all we get is the environmental stuff, a cutscene or two, and then the fight. Their deaths are tragic, but they could have hit much harder had we got the opportunity to get to know them more. Rundus ends up feeling the most tragic because his brief scenes do a good job of selling his personality to you, but like the others, I still feel like more could have been done with him. The game itself seems kind of aware of this issue, and so on the planet Norian, you can find 3 terminals that provide additional backstory that help round out the characters a bit more. Gore's personality shift when he controls his mech is elaborated upon, and Gandreda's hostile attitude is explained by her seeing Samus as a rival that she wishes to surpass. Of course, it would be much better to see these things reflected in cutscenes, but these logs do make me think of another possible solution. If you couldn't have any scenes between the game's opening and the Hunter's corruption, why not allow us to read their reports? Before we set off on our main mission, the Aurora unit mentions that the bounty hunters have stopped reporting 7 days ago, obviously due to their corruption. But that also implies the existence of communications logs that could be read.
This is her last message right before she disappeared.
Reading these could have allowed us to follow the bounty hunter's journey and thoughts as they are slowly corrupted, which could have added character. And of course it would make sense if we had access to them. The Aurora unit could give them to us to supplement our investigation. I don't know if those kinds of logs would have been enough to make these characters feel complete per se, but I think if they were written well enough, they could have gone a long way to making them feel less underdeveloped. Next, let's talk about the scan logs, something that this series is known for doing pretty well. While I've already stated that the multiple planets didn't fundamentally change the gameplay, that is not the case for the story. Now, instead of scanning the history and goings-on of a single planet, every single location now has their own separate narrative. And I'm happy to say that these narratives are just as good, and in some cases even better than the scan log narratives of prior games. One of the best moments of Prime 3 is the moment you land on the planet Brio. Upon seeing 2 impressive-looking statues, you're compelled to scan them, only to learn that these are not statues, but golems that can be piloted, which just immediately drives your imagination wild. And from there, you learn of an intense conflict between factions based in science and magic. You learn how the conflict polluted the land and drastically altered the climate. You learn of the different inventions and weapons created during the conflict, which appear all throughout the planet. You even learn how this information was originally inscribed on the walls you find them in. It's all very detailed and incredibly consistent with what you see. Elysia is this technological marvel. Its robot population and technology were developed by the Chozo for the purpose of firing satellites all across the galaxy to gather knowledge. The logs detail the Elysians' creation, as well as their use and maintenance of the skytown in which they reside, and that all pays off when you're allowed to fire satellites to reveal item locations, as well as obtain some bonus lore. Notably, you get logs detailing the fates of Talon 4 and Aether, the central planets of the prior 2 Prime games. And then we get to the pirate homeworld. After following the dramatic histories of Brio and Elysia, the pirate homeworld is comedy. One log details the pirates' struggle against Dark Samus, only for the following log to be those same pirates submitting to and worshipping her. The presumed speed in which this change in attitude happens just leaves you in awe. It so perfectly conveys how effectively Dark Samus brought them to heel, and it's one of the most brilliant bits of document-based storytelling I've ever seen in a game. In the following logs, we learn how they built themselves up under Dark Samus's power, with all of it leading up to their initial attack on the planet Norian. And after that, we see the events of the game from their perspective. We see their response to our progress on the previous areas, with the log stopping around the time we arrived at the pirate homeworld. And all of it is colored with this cultish mania, this crazy worship of Dark Samus. It's absolutely crazy, and it does a lot for Dark Samus's personality. It properly makes her character go beyond just the evil mutated Metroid Prime that eats Phazon and hates ya. To sum it all up, these stories are quite good, and due to the revisits required by the game, you don't get all of one planet's logs at once, meaning you often start or continue another story while being left hanging on another. This adds further value to any revisits you end up doing, and it gives the log storytelling a unique feeling apart from the linear storytelling done in prior games. Out of all the experiments Prime 3 did, this one was an absolute success. It takes the scanning and logs from the prior games and does something new and delightful. There's not much else to say story-wise. Outside of the frequent interactions with the Galactic Federation and some additional scenes, the story plays out pretty closely to all the prior games. Most of the story is told through logs and brief cutscenes, and then Samus goes and solves the problem. The additional characters and Samus's own corruption give it a different flavor, and they do pay all of that off in the finale sequence. When you begin that sequence, your health is replaced by a slowly filling corruption meter, turning the finale into a race to prevent your own demise. After all is said and blown up, the game's ending feels just as satisfying as the prior ones. You get to bask in your victory, and then it's off to the next mission. Prime 3 on the surface could be mistaken for a GameCube game, but the Wii was a step up in hardware, and Prime 3 ends up reflecting that very well. The game as a whole has the most stylish and detailed environments in the entire trilogy. From the details on textures, to the raw style of the architecture, to the new lighting, this game to this day is a delight to look at. I've already said as much in the story section, but I love how each environment in Brio specifically references the different parts of the planet's history. And that in turn means we get a large variety of good-looking environments on just this one planet. We get the planet's natural environment broken up by stone ruins and machinery, only to then suddenly arrive to the mines area, an environment made sinister with all this machinery and the light of this yellow fuel source. And just when you think you've seen everything, you suddenly warp to the dark side of the planet, where the climate has taken a turn. Adding on the machinery from both the pirates and the Federation, the journey through Brio is quite the visual buffet. Elysia has a more consistent biome. It's a beautiful tech-based city filled with all kinds of pretty machinery, and I love how the negative space of the empty sky adds to the awe of it all. The pirate homeworld's use of orange, red, and dark colors and machinery gives it this overwhelmingly evil aura that absolutely fits the attitude of these space pirates. This aura is also shared by the GFS Valhalla, which has a similar art palette to emphasize its own horror atmosphere. And of course there's Phazon. As you explore the infected planets, you'll of course come across small signs of infection here or there. And then when you finally enter the Leviathan Seed, it's almost like you get a preview of what will happen if you fail to stop the corruption, and it's a very pretty looking threat. I suppose I could also talk about the Norian and the Olympus, the Galactic Federation environments. I do find them to be kinds of generic sci-fi environment, but they don't look bad. Although as an aside, they do kinda remind me that the Metroid games look best when deviating from these kinds of environments, something that both Metroid Other M and Metroid Dread struggled with. I think one of the best things about the environments in the Prime series is how much effort went into making them all look different from each other. With a couple of exceptions, every single zone across the first 3 games are aesthetically different from each other. Compared to something like the Zelda series where you're guaranteed 1 forest and 1 lava environment per game, the Prime series makes an earnest effort to include a wide variety of biomes in their games. It's just another thing that makes going through the whole trilogy a delight, always getting something new every time you enter a new area. I don't have much to say regarding the music, but all of the main area themes are really good, and they help make their atmospheres. New to this game is that there are large sections in each area where those themes don't play, and in their place are more basic sounding tracks. I disliked this at first, but I later found that it helped me appreciate the main area themes more. I remembered in prior games that spending too much time in one section actually did make me get tired of its music, so Prime 3 having these breaks from the main themes is a good solution to that issue. Also, all of the main menus of Prime are known for having banger tracks, and of course Prime 3's is no exception. I'm curious as to which one people think is the best. Prime 2 and 4's themes are quite good, but I'm personally stuck between 1 and 3's. Prime 1 is of course a classic, but man, there's something about the way that Prime 3's hits. Overall, Prime 3's visuals and sound are good. They've been good across the series, and I think you can always expect them to be. Metroid Prime 3 ends up being another great Metroid Prime game. If you like the other Prime games or just like the idea of a 3D Metroidvania, then this game, as well as the other 2 games, will satisfy you. I found that its additions don't really sour the core Prime experience, and in a few instances they actually enhance it. But there is a problem. Not a problem with the game itself, but the series as a whole. When Metroid Prime 1 came out, it blew our socks off. There was nothing else like it at the time, and even today there isn't a lot of games I can think of that offer the same experience. The sequels couldn't be expected to blow our minds the same way, but after playing Prime 4 and going back and replaying all these games, I've come to the realization that the fundamental strengths and weaknesses of this series are the same across every single game, and I've come to believe that this series has never produced a proper sequel. It's never had a sequel that properly expanded upon or altered the core experience in a significant way. Prime 2 had its Dark World mechanic, but all it did was make the maps bigger and a bit more confusing. Prime 3 has a lot that implies change, but the only major differences are really in the storytelling and the combat. And the few power-ups that all these sequels add, or sometimes take away, only results in maybe 1 or 2 new puzzle variations. Now I understand what counts as a proper sequel is quite subjective, but I do think that the idea that the series is stagnating is supported in the review scores. Very consistently, each sequel tends to review a little worse than the last. Not because the sequels were worse, but because they didn't change enough and were more of the same. And yeah, Prime 4 probably reviewed worse due to its actual poor quality rather than stagnancy, but when that game isn't shoving bland NPCs in your face or starving you in its empty-ass desert, it is being more Metroid Prime, same strengths and flaws as before, and because of that I still believe that Prime 4 still would have rated lower even if you cut out its issues. Metroid Prime 3 comes the closest in my opinion to being this proper sequel. But I'm still doing the same kind of spider ball puzzles, I'm still fighting every boss in giant arenas, the enemies are still designed the same way, my basic movement options are still the exact same, story progression is still linear. I could go on and on about it. Retro Studios have always been consistent in the quality of their output, and based on interviews, they definitely have the desire to expand and make this proper sequel. Their recent difficulties in Prime 4's reception, however, make that possibility uncertain, because shortly after Prime 4 came out, Retro revealed that they didn't have the resources and structure to make a Prime game when they took over its development. This resulted in them needing to restructure and also outsource the development of art assets and cutscenes. If Prime 5 is a possibility, then that will need to be the one to alter the fundamentals to finally break the series' stagnation. Prime 5 will need to go all the way back to Prime 1 and use that as a base to expand ideas outward in order to create something new. Whatever the future holds, it was nice going through all these games again. Even if they aren't evolving in the way I'd prefer, the initial trilogy of games are all good times and I highly recommend them. It was fun analyzing this series again, and while I discovered their flaws, I also rediscovered what I loved about them. The atmosphere, the storytelling, the boss fights, the satisfying feeling of gaining power and solving puzzles. It's all done really well. It's been a while since I made a video. I stopped doing so years ago because making them ended up not being so fun. I've changed a lot since then, and I'm hoping that the resulting growth will allow me to turn this whole thing into a proper hobby. Because I do love talking about games, and I would like to expand that love by making some videos. Hopefully I'll get better at concluding these things, because all I can think to say now is hope you enjoyed yourselves and y'all have a nice day.